Welcome back to Access Point, the podcast where cybersecurity meets operational strategy in the world's most mission-critical environments.
I'm Chip Hughes, Chief Product Officer at Imprivata.
And I'm Joel Burleson Davis, Chief Technology Officer of Imprivata. I'm excited about our subject today. We're going to be talking about Passwordless.
So Passwordless, FIDO, what do those things mean? What's MFA? Where do those things sit into the ecosystem? And our guest, I think, we just actually talked to him, really robust conversation around what they're doing to really help standardize around passwordless and passwordless technologies and integrations and how to make that successful. I think it's a really, really powerful conversation.
Yeah. And it's so exciting to sort of push towards that dream of the future where, access is easy, but also secure, right? It's been a long time coming. And it's, we're finally getting to the place, where the technology is and where the industries are to really get that, land at that dream or that vision.
Yep, that's right. So hopefully you're about to listen to the interview that we had. If you have questions, obviously reach out to us as Imprivata. If you're interested in what we're doing, reach out to the FIDO Alliance. They have been a great partner for us. And so I cannot sort of plug them enough in terms of what they're doing, their website, those sorts of things, and where that sits. I think they're super helpful, and you'll hear at the end a bunch of resources that the FIDO Alliance can help with. So really great. So now, without any further ado, let's get to the interview. Enjoy.
Welcome everybody to Access Point. With me is Chip Hughes and also Andrew Shikyar, the CEO of the FIDO Alliance. Welcome, guys.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Joel.
So, Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit about the FIDO Alliance, who you are, what you do, and then, sort of what the real mission is that I think we're both after.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks again for having me. It's great to be here with you guys. So FIDO Alliance is an industry body focused on reducing the world's reliance on passwords. We're an open standards organization. We have over 300 members worldwide, including Imprivata, where companies come together to do three key things. First of all, we create technical standards for user authentication and related aspects of digital identity. Secondly, we run a very robust certification program to certify that products are meeting these standards and interoperating with one another. And we also measure for things like biometric performance. And then third, we focus a lot on adoption of these technologies. So, you run the mill marketing programs, but also inside the FIDO Alliance, we have different bodies comprised of members that look at things like how to optimize user experience for the user journey with passkeys. We look at different use cases and scenarios and issue best practice guidance. So it's really those three things as a body that we do. We've been around for over 13 years. And most recently, of course, we've seen broad adoption of passkeys, which is really the consumerization of the underlying FIDO protocols that we've been working on all this time.
That's great. And how did you get your start with the FIDO Alliance? How did you get into this journey with us all?
Yeah, so I've been in the digital identity space for longer than I'd like to admit. So since around 2001, and I was out of the space for a bit, and FIDO, a couple of years after it launched, was looking for someone to drive the marketing. Now, I'd been in and out of the kind of industry standard space and actually committed to myself to never get back into standards again. But, talked to the executive director at the time, who I knew from a previous relationship, and said, look, I'll help you get this thing up and running. Then before I knew it, I blinked and here I am. But no, I very quickly realized that this was a very special organization, both in the remit and in the people who take part in it. And I'm feel very fortunate to have had this opportunity, and it's really been both the challenge and the reward of my career doing what I'm doing.
Yep, it's awesome. It feels like it's really taking off, particularly when you were talking about passkeys and how many websites now. I know even this last week, I got a big email and just, hey, we're going to move to passkeys. It's more secure and it's so much easier to use. So I think it's both a noble cause and it's such a better experience just from that end user perspective. So it's I'd be really proud if I were you, I guess is the best way to put it, because I think it's really exciting.
It's fun to leave. It's fun to be part of the organization and do something. I think one of the most best points of passkeys is that my parents now actually understand what I do for a living. They never just swore. Now they can say, oh, my son does stuff with passkeys. And so that's it actually makes it very tangible, which is helpful.
Yeah, it's great. So you hit on sort of this idea of passwordless. And, that's one of the things I know Joel and I talk a lot about. Just that word is always interesting to me, and sort of general perspective on what do you mean when you say passwordless? So sort of dive into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, look, passwordless is the goal. That's the vision. But really, it's about less passwords and taking passwords out of play. So a lot of people that are introducing passkeys to consumers, may still have a password as a fallback, but are working to push it further and further into the background to the point where it can be eliminated. Passwords have always been the problem statement for FIDO Alliance, and they remain the problem statement for the world at large. The data breach we read about, the ransomware attacks, and all these, most of the attacks we hear about, the damages we hear about, all come back to relying on a password or legacy forms of two-factor authentication that also rely on human readable shared secrets. And so the sooner we can move everyone to unphishable authentication or unphishable multi-factor authentication, the better we'll be. And that's really where FIDO's focused, by introducing open standards and kind of a certified product ecosystem for user-friendly asymmetric public key cryptography, which is both the mouthful and the earful, but basically, is deploying, incredibly strong technology in a user-friendly format, which is critical. One of our tagline has always been simpler, stronger authentication. And the simpler part of it is absolutely critical, because if your MFA or any sort of authentication is too strong or too difficult to use, your consumers simply won't opt in and your employees will find workarounds. So you need to find that kind of Goldilocks zone. And that's where FIDO's been focused. And I think, passkeys have introduced that to the world at large, which is why we've seen such strong adoption.
Yeah, I think we see that sort of those two things playing out, the sort of the end user experience of what is sort of passwordless, for the non-sophisticated user, a plugin auto-filling their password in their websites is passwordless, right? Let's function them as passwordless, right? But from this this sort of security perspective, that's like not even close and probably worse. And sort of, so it is a really interesting, it's something that we strive to do here as well, is like, ever increasing sort of the ability to respond to the threat environment out there, but not like push that burden onto the users. In those two different populations think about that in completely different ways.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You hit on this. I don't think the aspiration is still to get rid of the password. And I think of that in a couple different ways. I think of that in sort of human interaction, right? I think we can get to this place where no one ever has to enter a password again. And that should be something that we actually can achieve. And, this idea of phishing resistant sort of authenticators and what that looks like, I think that that's very achievable. Yeah. If I'm actually, Improvat is much more focused on enterprise side things than we are necessarily sort of that customer, that SIAM type use case that you might see from a market perspective. The goal, and what I also really like about FIDO and what I see with y'all is, if I can get that password off of the network entirely, that is really ultimately the end state that we're trying to get to. And so, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but that's one of the things that we think about a lot is, if I can remove it from a human interaction perspective, that's sort of a natural first stage. And then trying to really get to a state where I'm modernizing and using these type of technologies is ultimately that nirvana state. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, 100%. And I think it's absolutely critical to take passwords out of play, especially in the enterprise, and starting, part of the deployment strategy is starting with, some of the higher impact areas, right? So taking out of play for like your admins or IT workers. And you look at a lot of the scattered spider attacks, they focus on customer support, people like that. So, find your most vulnerable spots and start there and then take them out of play and taking them off the network. And I think there's some great success stories of people going fully passwordless at very large scale. A couple of years ago, I did a keynote at Identiverse, and I brought on some guest speakers to talk about how they're using FIDO. And one of my favorite moments from that was one of the CISO leads at Bank of America. He talked about how he moved hundreds of thousands, or they moved hundreds of thousands of B of A employees off of passwords onto a variety of FIDO solutions for sign-in, converge access card, apps, you name it. They're doing, layering FIDO all over the place to take passwords out of play. And I asked him, like, hey, what are your KPIs? What are the things that, that you look back on to measure your success? He's like, well, one of my top KPIs is sleep. I can sleep at night knowing that when the next social engineering attack, hits my company, and that when my employees take that bait and click on it, that they will not be phished. They will not lose their credentials. They will not give up network access. And I think that's absolutely critical. You can look at case study after case study where these attacks, run over enterprises worldwide, and those that are using FIDO-based solutions are not, are not victimized. Whereas those that rely on legacy forms of, authentication and including, text-based codes that can be transmitted, human readable codes, are always victimized by these attacks. So I think, sleep as a KPI is an important one for your audience to hear about, that they can find with, FIDO2 based solutions.
I think it's a great point. The other thing I think a lot about is that user interaction and just that experience piece. And I know we hit on this, but it's I got to be able to sleep, but also those doctors got to be able to log in. We got to be able to do that as seamlessly as possible. And part of what I just think FIDO really solves for is you can kind of do both, right? We can sort of solve for that. There are some use cases we look at where you've got a badge can be FIDO compliant. That is a much more secure badge than some of the alternative options that are out there in terms of just basic authentication and how we can solve for some of this stuff. So completely agree with you.
I was in the ER recently with a family member. Everything's fine, but it's fascinating. So, I was looking at it from kind of my FIDO nerd standpoint and looking at people swiping in, badging in, logging in, like how many people need to access, shared devices or different devices securely and quickly, and like taking time to sign in with a password was not an option. Also, being locked out was not an option, right? That's so, like, consistency, ease of use, accessibility, these are critical, in this vertical scenario. But also, you think about any enterprise, right? You want all your employees, you want to have high employee uptime, you want to have employee satisfaction, you want to reduce call center costs, help desk costs. You want your IT team to be doing things that are real IT, not resetting passwords. And these are all benefits that we're hearing. We have quantifiable, feedback on this. These are benefits that enterprises are seeing when, moving to, FIDO-based solutions for workforce authentication.
That makes a ton of sense.
I was going to say this, one of the things that this, that sort of brings up is like, why is the password so hard to kill then, right? Like, why is the FIDO Alliance has been around for 13 years and passkeys have been out for, 3 years, and the technology is there, the value is there for the workflow, for the end user and for the security. But why is that still hard? Why are we seeing slow adoptions in many cases, across the world?
One of my favorite quotes, and it wasn't mine originally, but I now rip it off all the time, was someone called passwords, the cockroaches of the internet. You just can't get rid of them, right? I mean, but think about, so passwords have let's talk about passwords a little bit, like thematically, right? So passwords have a couple of advantages. First of all, incumbents. Right? Passwords have been around for over 60 years. They're old enough to collect Social Security, but they've been around forever. We've known this for decades. We've known passwords are a threat for decades. Bill Gates, I think in 2002, 2002, went on stage RSA, talking about the death of the password. And we've known it's an issue, but really for, let's say, since the turn of the century. And our answer to addressing that problem has been adding on layers, right? We know the first layer sucks. Well, how do we make it better? Let's add another layer on. So, let's send an OTP code. And this, very quickly turned out to be insufficient solution because instead of having one password, you have two. And so what we've learned over time is that, what we really need to do is actually replace the primary factor. And it's taken a long time to get there, right? Because going back to why do passwords stick around, they have the advantage of incumbents and usability, right? So we can all relate to the problems of forgetting a password and trying to, type a password on a keyboardless device or, God forbid, a smart TV. But the fact of the matter is you can do that, and they can work most places. So they just work. And so when FIDO Alliance, set off on our pretty audacious goal to reduce the world's reliance on passwords, we had to look at how do you take on some of these advantages of incumbents and usability and user awareness. And we've done that in a very methodical way. First of all, by building the underlying protocols, but secondly, by close collaboration with W3C and the WebAuthn work that we did, that actually started building FIDO into the fabric of the web itself, which then in turn led to FIDO being supported in virtually every modern computing device. So the advantage of incumbents that passwords have and just being there FIDO had to replicate by having in-device support, endpoint support, which we now have. The other challenges to adoption are usability and awareness, and also I'd say government compliance and support. And so we've also worked very closely with regulators around the world to have them understand how FIDO works, to the point where now FIDO is being specified in different regulatory regimes, right? Which pushes us into global industry, regulated industry, from kind of a top-down basis. And so the last ingredient was passkeys, right? When we introduced passkey as a brand and a term, we did that 3 years ago. FIDO had been around for a decade before that and had been used quite widely. Right, had been used very widely in different enterprise and consumer settings, but without this term and capability that passkeys introduced, we never would have seen the consumer success that we're seeing. Right, so what we did in 3 years ago, we introduced two key things. First of all, we changed the way that FIDO could be deployed, allowing the private key and the FIDO key pair to be securely synchronized to clouds across a credential provider cloud. So say iCloud, for example, such that if you enroll as a consumer for a passkey or FIDO on one on a site on one device, it'll be readily available on the same device. So I enroll my iPad, it's available on my MacBook or my iPhone. That was a very big shift that we'd heard we needed to make to address the consumer market. Secondly, we introduced a term and the logo program associated with passkeys. And so for the first time, sites that were actually using the same technology could talk about the same technology. So previously, if you're using WebAuthn, say on eBay, it might say, the next time sign with your face. Or Best Buy was saying, next time use WebAuthn. These are terms that didn't mean anything to consumers. So by introducing some common lexicon, and also at the same time introducing best practice guidance on how to roll this out, we really helped kind of jumpstart the awareness and adoption of passkeys. Most importantly, what we've seen on the consumer front is that they've led to fantastic results, right? So we estimate over 15 billion consumer accounts have the option of using a passkey, but perhaps most significantly, we're seeing huge brands, adopt passkeys and expand their adoption, right? So Amazon has over 150 million consumers using passkeys, Google over 1 billion, right? So they're not doing this just for the heck of it, right? They're doing it because they're hitting key metrics that every service provider wants to see, which is how quickly can my user sign in and how successful are they? And in both instances, they're seeing vast improvements. So people are getting online quicker and more successfully and more often. And that's leading to second line benefits such as reduced fraud and increased revenues. So these business benefits are helping reinforce the benefits of the urgency to deploy passkeys and are driving more and more companies to do so.
It's interesting. You talked about it needs to be prevalent everywhere. I remember I was at a different company at the time, but when Microsoft, Google, and Apple all came out and basically said that they were going to support this concept of passkeys and sync passkeys, just sitting there going, this is going to be a game changer. And I think that was one of the biggest things that sort of has unlocked that consumer market as well in terms of what we're able to do. I'd be curious, just your perspective, if I'm an enterprise and I want to start looking at passkeys, sort of what have you seen adoption like inside the four walls, even though there's no four walls, but just for enterprises now, not that consumer market necessarily as much. And what are you seeing there?
Yeah, we're seeing, FIDO's always had a key role to play in the enterprise because they actually have more control over the user experience, more control over the user being the employee. So security keys have been deployed for decades, in fact, for over a decade. In fact, one of the first use cases was driven by that, right? If you go back to FIDO's lineage, we had two protocols. There's Universal Second Factor, which was based on security keys, and UAF, which is a biometric reauthentication. But a lot of the work was driven by, phishing attacks on large enterprises. And that's where U2F really came into being. And that's where we've seen keys in the workforce for quite some time. So, we continue to see strong adoption in the enterprise. It's harder to get a lot of data on that. But again, we've done some surveys that show enterprises that have deployed passkeys are seeing wide success on across some of the key metrics we talked about. So reduce fraud, reduce help desk costs, increased uptime, and higher employee satisfaction. Oftentimes, these enterprises, it's hard to generalize enterprises because they vary so much from one to the next. But oftentimes there's a staged rollout where they can work with a trusted provider to figure out the best way to move things forward. Oftentimes it starts with, is, again, starting with a core group and rolling outwards from there, or thinking about what are my core assets I need to protect and make sure that you're using, say, security keys there. One other observation I have, in the enterprise is that there's a lot of innovation happening actually on the hardware side, on the key side and kind of the authenticator side. So we're seeing people use, apps on personal devices, BYOD, or in company issued devices. We're seeing security keys. The converged access card is very interesting, right? Where you have an access card that has a FIDO token in it, both to get you in the front door to swipe into things, but also can be used on your desktop. So we're seeing those innovations, I think, are helping enterprises think differently about how I can deploy FIDO most successfully to a diverse workforce. Also, you need to contemplate things like, where is my workforce? Am I in one building? Do I have mobile workers? Do I have shared devices? Like, there's so many wrinkles to this that that's why I feel really great about kind of the FIDO certified ecosystem that we have, is that it gives enterprises a variety of choices to figure out how to kind of meet them where they are, right? So if so Improbot is focused on healthcare, right? Then you have expertise in that space to help, healthcare companies, deploy FIDO successfully. Other people are focused on, different verticals or different, deployment types. The good thing is there's a FIDO certified solution for most of these to help companies move away from passwords as quickly as possible.
Yep. No, for sure. It's been interesting too. We have multiple different product lines that support what we call different workflows. So different ways users interact, and we can use device-bound passkeys on a laptop, and all of a sudden I can do pretty strong association between that user, that laptop, and almost think of that as, now if I have a passkey and I can do that seamlessly, if that user has unlocked it, I feel very, very good about that as a factor. And then sort of that trust can transfer into other things I'm doing. But we look at it there, we look at it badging, we look at mobile and where it fits into that. It's a really unique set of tools and things that we can use to sort of drive a better user experience that is also more secure, which is ultimately what we really want. So I feel really, really good about where that goes. Joel, I don't know if you had any other questions on that front.
I did, like, one of the things you talked about it a little bit. I'm so curious of, if you have an example of like a successful journey of going from like nothing to like, a good rollout. Because I think some of the dynamic here is, all right, I've got a workforce, I've got passwords ingrained in them. Like, what does that journey really look at? Like, you talked about a staged rollout, and you talked about like different ways of going about it. But like, can you paint that picture for me of what you've seen successful, going from nothing to close to the, as close as possible to passwords getting replaced?
Yeah, and let's be clear, people are replacing passwords altogether, right? So we have success stories on that. We have case studies on our website that detail this. We have our Authenticate conference coming up in October, where we'll hear even more case studies about enterprises that are eliminating a password altogether. And every company has a different culture, different kind of IT setup, but oftentimes, it's hard to generalize, but, oftentimes it does start with a kind of internal POC. So if you're starting out, I have passwords, how do I get started? Oftentimes it feels daunting. How do I get moving down this path? How do I get started on
the product dynamics? Like, okay, I'm here in this bad situation that I know about, but it's a situation I know about. How do I get from, like, how do I just start making that first step and that second step and that third step?
Yes, oftentimes it starts with an internal POC, and you find a team that will do it. And sometimes that's the IT team, because they tend to be a little more savvy and more open to trying things, and you get them, starting. It's also probably a most sensitive team, and you start there. And then I've seen people move straight from there up to the executive suite. Because ultimately, this sort of thing, I feel and quite strongly about this in general, is that cybersecurity needs to be a corporate imperative, an executive imperative, right? So getting the C-suite bought into this as soon as possible is really important, because then when it's being pushed out to all the workers who naturally are resistant to change, if the C-suite say, hey, we're using this, you need to use it too. It's different than IT saying, hey, use this new thing. So going top down is very important. So moving, from a POC and as quickly as possible, getting executive buy-in and using and utilization, I think is really helpful in driving this company-wide rollout.
And I think the thing we consistently see is, don't let perfection be the enemy of progress, right? Like, especially in this space, that whole, going back to the very beginning of this, that whole idea of passwordless, doesn't mean you're completely eliminating the password everywhere. You need to be thinking of it iteratively and how you can get there. And so, that's one of the things when we talk to customers, really important, at least from my perspective, because a lot of times it's just so overwhelming. We've got so many legacy things that require passwords here, there. Well, that journey starts with a single step, and you got to go through that process.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And something else to think about for companies that are, keeping password as a recovery mechanism is to kind of layer on some risk signals associated with that, right? So when using a password becomes an anomalous behavior or it should be seen as an anomalous behavior, right? So if someone is triggering a recovery using a password, that should trigger all sorts of alerts, right? So maybe it's not as easy. Maybe it's not a self-serve recovery mechanism anymore if you're using that password for recovery versus other kind of identifying functions that you can use for recovery. Yeah, so there's ways to, so as long as you have these passwords lingering around, as long as you have these cockroaches under the couch, put some safeguards around them to make sure that you're aware of where they are and that you are mitigating the threats they're in.
I love that idea. I reset my password, that triggers some sort of incident in my soccer sim, whatever it is, and just making sure they're reviewing it. It's a complete flip of
tracking with it or something. Like, we don't want this.
At the end of the day, it's all about signals, right? And risk signals and trust signals and things like that. And FIDO, as the passkey, is a very powerful signal, right? Saying that this person, is highly confident this is Chip or Joel or Andrew, signing in here. But ultimately, you may, depending on your scenario, may want to have added signals behind that. But likewise, if Andrew's using a password all of a sudden, not a passkey, well, that's weird, right? And so you could actually, I've talked to some consumer service providers who will now actually add a delay into what you can do with that reset, or maybe it needs to be personally reviewed. And so I think the more that we push passwords into the background in the kind of the daily workflow, both in the workforce and as consumers, the quicker consumers will adjust to this password-less world, and we can put these things in the dustbin once and for all.
Wonderful. So if I'm an enterprise and I want to go down this journey and I want to start thinking, how does FIDO sort of fit in from a enterprise working with you? What does that model look like?
Well, so typically enterprises are welcome to take part in FIDO Alliance. We are a member organization. We have a working group called the Enterprise Deployment Working Group, where enterprise practitioners compare notes on their own rollouts. But typically, enterprise will look for a FIDO certified provider. That's someone who has a toolkit or a platform, SDK, whatever it might be, that they can leverage and help them with their rollout. Most leading identity and IAM providers support FIDO, either explicitly or through third-party solutions. So there's options there as well. So I'd encourage enterprises to talk to their, if they have an IAM vendor in-house, talk to them about their objectives for rolling out FIDO or using passkeys, or also looking at other resources online. So we have a site called Passkey Central, which is really meant to help companies build their passkey business case, understand how to start their passkey journey. We also have our Authenticate conference, which is a fantastic time for anyone interested in learning about the ins and outs of why and how to deploy passkeys, to attend that either in person or remotely. And then we have other resources on the FIDO Alliance website as well.
That's great. I know we send a couple of people to Authenticate, and I know it's super, super valuable. So I would definitely plug that just as a great thing if you're looking for those sorts of things.
Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. Everybody, this was Andrew Shikyar, the CEO of the FIDO Alliance. I think it's really great. The vision of the passwordless future, the secure and frictionless access of things is one we share. And so it was great to have you on the show.
Yep. Thanks so much.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and follow Access Point on your favorite podcast platform. We also welcome your feedback. Please send us any thoughts, insights, or suggestion to accesspointpodcast@imprivata.com or find us on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Chip and he's Joel. This has been Access Point.